Good evening and welcome to the latest edition of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I'm the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka, and I'm honored to be with you tonight, facilitating this important discussion about ways to resist the increasing violations of the digital rights of Palestinians and their allies in Palestine, regionally, and beyond. From invasive surveillance systems like Pegasus to social media censorship on Instagram, Facebook, and beyond, Israeli violations of Palestinians' digital rights have increased, especially since the 2021 Unity Intifada and the rise in global solidarity with Palestinians. But it's important to also acknowledge that these violations are perpetuated by private enterprises and governments the world over. Which local, regional, and global actors are impacting this troubling development in Palestine advocacy? What role does Israel play in activating and circulating these repressive mechanisms locally and across the world? Are there positive aspects to these realities which could be employed in movement building? What is being done and what should be done to protect the digital rights of Palestinians and their allies in colonized Palestine, regionally, and across the globe? To answer these questions and delve deeper into this developing trend, I'm joined tonight by Al-Shabaka policy analyst Nadim Nashif and digital rights activist Raya Sharbain. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being with us tonight. Nadim Nashif is a social entrepreneur and digital rights defender. He is also the founder and general director of Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, a Palestinian digital rights organization. And he is co-founder of Wusul Digital Academy, a digital marketing educational center. For the past 20 years, Nadim has worked on youth and community development issues, including founding and directing Baladna, the Association for Arab Youth. Raya Sharbain works with the Tor Project and the Jordan Open Source Association. She works to promote digital rights and supports journalists and defenders with digital security. She holds a master's in human computer interaction from University College London in the United Kingdom. Before we begin, I'd just like to inform our viewers of the format of tonight's Policy Lab. So for the first 30 minutes or so, I'll pose questions to Raya and Nadim. During the second half of the lab, our speakers will answer questions from you, our audience. Throughout the discussion, please submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question below. And remember that you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. Please also, if possible, direct your question to one of our speakers. I'll do my best in the time given to address as many of your questions as I can. So let's begin. Nadim, let's start with you. As executive director of Hamle, you are front and center in the effort to protect the digital rights of Palestinians across colonized Palestine. What are some of the factors impacting Palestinian digital rights, including the Israeli regime, the Palestinian Authority, social media companies, and even pressures within Palestinian society?
Thank you, Nadim, and thank you all for pulling this event together, and happy to be here with you. Basically, the last years, we can say even from 2015, there is more and more pressure on the net, trying to control the internet, trying to control the narrative. Specifically, I mean, this is obviously like a global phenomenon, but specifically in the Palestinian context, there are more and more sites who are trying to get hold and to control what's being written and what's being said. The Palestinian context is obviously politically complicated, and maybe other digital rights movements in other countries are facing one government and one parliament and trying to influence. But for us, for Hamli as a digital rights organization, it's much more complicated situation because there are several governments and there are several realities that are interlinked. At the same time, there are differences that are happening there. So the factors that are influencing the Palestinian digital rights are governments and companies and the society itself. So if we start from the side of the government, in the Palestinian internal side, you have the Palestinian Authority that is trying through the cyber crime law to get a hold and to control the internet. And unfortunately, the Palestinian cyber crime law is not a law in compliance with human rights or with digital rights. And in many cases, it allows criminalization of political opponents, and a very problematic law, I may say. The other part of the problem that's happening in the side of the Palestinian Authority is the whole issue of privacy and not protecting the data of the people and letting it kind of open market that people are trading with the data and the information of the people, specifically with the Palestinian telecommunication companies. The other side of it is the Hamas de facto government in Gaza Strip, where basically they are using certain legislation again to control what's happening on the online, specifically political opponents. So they use this part of legislation that's called misuse of technology, and basically under like vague definitions, every political opponent, everybody who's criticizing would be basically criminalized or at least being investigated, etc., etc. From the side of the Israeli government, obviously the problems are way bigger. I mean, as a occupying power in the 67 areas, using this territory as a kind of one big open laboratory to test different technologies of surveillance, starting from facial recognition cameras. Lately, we heard about the Blue Wolf technology that's being deployed in Hebron and in other cities of the West Bank. And the Blue Wolf technology is a technology that is combining basically facial recognition technology with security classifications. So basically, the soldiers who are at the checkpoints would take a picture of the Palestinian. They would have a mobile phone in it. There is an application. They would take a picture of the Palestinian who's trying to cross the checkpoint, and the application would tell them if this person should be arrested, interrogated, get hold of him, or let him go, or in many cases also to take a picture of this person because they are missing him in the imagery database. So it's a situation where the Palestinian basically is being surveilled by the Israelis 24 hours, 7 days a week. So we spoke about the facial recognition cameras, we spoke about Blue Wolf, we know about Pegasus being used against Palestinian activists and human rights organizations. We know about tapping phones, and we know about technologies to follow up the social media accounts of the Palestinians in a systematic way. Let alone of all of this, I mean, speaking about the infrastructure, the whole infrastructure of the Palestinian telecommunication sector is being controlled by the Israelis. So you can understand also how much they can also manipulate and how much this put at risk the Palestinians. But adding to this, that there are laws and legislations that are coming to criminalize Palestinians, including the recent Facebook bill that they are trying to push forward, and I mean, it went halfway through. But also other pieces of legislations, including heavy use of vague definitions of incitement, national security, etc., etc. And the result is basically hundreds of Palestinians annually being jailed because of their digital activism. As this is from the side of the Israeli government. Of course, I mean, going to the companies also have lots of pressure coming from the Israeli side, where basically they are pushing them to take down the Palestinian stories and to play down the Palestinian narrative on those platforms. Our problems with the companies, mainly and specifically with the social media companies, is about how the policy of their content moderation policy is being shaped, like how they define incitement, the level of cooperation that they have with the Israeli cyber unit. So we know that they have a high rate of saying yes to this unit, up to 90% of saying yes to the takedowns request, which means basically that we know tens of thousands of requests being sent from the Israeli cyber unit and the Israeli Ministry of Justice, who are playing the focal point between the Israeli government and the companies. And then these companies, and we're talking specifically about Meta as the biggest one and most important, but obviously this goes also similarly to TikTok and to Twitter and the rest of them. And this is obviously being a problem. The other problem is basically over moderation that is also coming from the side of the companies because of use of artificial intelligence and using keywords and treating several Palestinian fractions and political movements as terrorist organizations, and that's why they are not allowed. So if I try to summarize like what's happening in the social media platforms, is basically from one hand you have the pressure of the Israeli cyber unit, you have from the other hand the artificial intelligence being used and the keywords and taking automatic takedowns, and then the third part of it is basically different kind of unofficial Israeli groups who are actually official, who are doing online brigading and massive reporting and abusing the system of reporting basically to make sure that they are taking down Palestinian content. Moving forward, I mean, the whole issue of other companies like payment platforms, digital payment platforms, who are not allowing Palestinians to use them, like PayPal. PayPal is allowing freely the Israeli settlers to use the platform, but Palestinians in 67 areas are not allowed to use this platform, despite that these platforms are working in more than 200 countries and territories across the globe. Another point is around Google and Google Maps and which story these maps are telling. And unfortunately, they are adopting totally the Israeli narrative and ignoring the Palestinian one. The last kind of companies that we are facing, obviously, are the surveillance companies like NSO, Cellbrite, Candero, Anyvision, Osto, and all of those Israeli mainly surveillance companies who are an integral part of the security Israeli establishment, because they start from there and they continue selling the technologies all over. I mean, so that, as I said at the beginning, we are a kind of laboratory where these technologies being tested, the knowledge accumulated there, and then the veterans of these units, they go out, start their startup, and start selling this knowledge and this technology all over the world, including to other Arab regimes and to many other oppressive regimes across the globe. Lastly, I want to also mention that also parts of the problems are also internal, coming from society parts. In many cases, we also see attacks against several segments of the society, including women, young women, LGBTQ groups. Unfortunately, we had this smear campaign in the last weeks also inside the Palestinian against some Palestinian LGBTQ activists. So this is in brief trying to portray the picture of the different elements that are influencing Palestinian digital rights situation.
And thank you so much, Nadim, for such a thorough summary of the scope of what's happening. Maybe we can get back to some of the details during the Q&A. But in terms of one aspect of what you said, and given Raya's expertise and research, let's talk about this regional and global influence of surveillance schemes and techniques. Raya, you've researched the role that the Israeli regime plays in manipulating and pressuring third-party actors globally. You're based in Jordan, but your work has extended beyond. Pressuring these actors into employing surveillance systems and silencing Palestinian voices and the voices of their allies. How exactly does Israel wield its power in this sphere? And what effect has it had in terms of the global Palestine solidarity movement?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's a true honor. So it's very interesting. The Pegasus project was, and Pegasus is one of the spyware that the Israeli occupation company called NSO is selling. It's just one of many. The Pegasus project was revealed back in July last year, so it's 12 months today, revealing that over 50,000 people around the world were potentially targeted with the spyware. Today, we know which countries we know about. I'm not sure in numbers, but we know many journalists, human rights defenders, activists across the globe have been targets of Pegasus. As of yesterday, we know that 14 European countries from the EU, there are 28 countries in the EU, so half of the EU has been also a target of Pegasus spyware. This includes presidents of countries, this includes politicians, diplomats. But actually what was interesting to me is when early this year, the New York Times published like a more or less extensive report on how the Israeli occupation reaped diplomatic gains via selling NSO's premium spyware Pegasus to various countries around the world. So it's ranging from Mexico down to Panama, all over to India. And it's countries like Mexico and Panama that maybe once voted in favor of Palestine and Palestinian rights at the UN decision tables. They've shifted their positions in favor of the Israeli occupation following their purchase of Pegasus. Their main reason for purchasing Pegasus motivation is to silence dissent, of course. But the occupation also secured the support of neighboring Arab nations like UAE, Bahrain, and others. They've all recently normalized their relations with the occupation under the guise of peace and, I don't know, let's throw another jargon word, prosperity. But what appeared as peace deals on the surface, they turned out to be large arms trades between countries. And this includes, obviously, cyber arms like Pegasus. Something I learned from Hamle is that the Israeli occupation hosts the highest number of surveillance companies per capita, which is also a sign of insecurity, in my opinion. But let's flip a coin for a second. This is an occupying power that's developing a lot of its capacity and skills to increase its surveillance capabilities, but it's also very afraid that we start surveying it. So there's, I'm not sure if people know this, but back in mid-90s, Bill Clinton, under the Bill Clinton administration in the US, they decided to release satellite footage of space stations or satellite footage taken by the US military, I believe. And so they were about to pass a law to Congress and then Senate saying we're going to release these satellite imagery. One congressperson and one senator faced lobbying from different Israeli groups in the US to try to amend the law to say, yes, release these high resolution images of the planet Earth in different countries, with the exception of this little spot, which is called Palestine, and some like to call it the Israeli occupation. So this was called actually the Carl Bingaman Amendment back in '97, and it's affected all of the satellite imagery we see today. So I think most people use Apple Maps, Google Maps. Google Maps and Apple Maps source their maps from US sources and US government sources. And so you might notice that if you try on Google Earth to zoom in on different parts of Palestine, it's going to be much more pixelated than the rest of the world. I can make up buildings in various parts, like in Amman where I am, but if I go down to another city within Palestine, I can barely make up roads and where things are. So two researchers in Oxford were very intrigued by this amendment, and there was a reason, because they were archaeologists and they needed to look at maps all the time. So they tried to fight against this amendment, and their main motivation was really scientific. Eventually, it's difficult to remove laws. It's much easier to create laws. So they were able to just push for this restriction to be lowered a bit. So eventually, we now have a bit higher resolution images of Palestine on Google Maps and Apple Maps, but they're still not very completely updated. One of the regions that's mostly affected is actually Gaza. Gaza is still blurry on Google Maps and Apple Maps on various other mapping software we use today. And this affects us because when we want to know the level of destruction that's happening when the occupying power is shooting rockets on buildings, we can barely make up the difference. And now that, let's say, starting 2020, some Google Maps and Apple Maps started to upload more higher resolution images. We now have higher resolution images of Palestine just starting 2020, whereas I can go back to the early 2000s to see the rest of the regions, how it looks like from the top. So this is to say, even something outside of my jurisdiction as a Palestinian living in Jordan, a decision that was made in the 90s back in the US has also affected me. A small little person living in Amman who also likes to see what is Palestine, where is Palestine, and try to make up the different parts. But also this kind of, it's also speaks for the magnitude of the capacity of the Israeli occupation to put so much pressure into various different corners of our digital life, in order to, one, survey us more, but also limit our expression and also limit how much we can see of Palestine.
Thank you, Raya, and how chilling to think that this is the extent. I mean, and you just gave us a couple of minutes describing it, but the extent to which the Israeli regime wields its power this way globally. Let's talk now about policy and activism and what's being done. Nadim, let's go back to you. What are civil society organizations like Hamle and others doing inside colonized Palestine to counter this rise in the digital violations? What else needs to be done?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, when we started, part of the problem was that there was not enough knowledge about these issues. Nobody was, I mean, the whole issue is obviously new, but there was no organizations or academia people who are researching those policies and trying to analyze them, because in the end of the day, if you want to do any kind of activism or advocacy, you need also to understand the policy from where they are coming. So we worked a few years on researching all the companies, like each company, their policies, what they are doing, how they are biased, how they are discriminating Palestinians in the policies. Similarly, going into laws and legislations and regulations, and publishing lots of position papers and reports about them, so the public would know, the public would understand, and to raise the issue of the privacy, the issue of that somebody is watching you all the time. In many cases, also people are not fully aware to what extent these phenomena and these violations are there. And I think everything kind of got boosted with the COVID-19, because even the people who were not digitalized were pushed into that. People who were kind of refusing and in denial situation about the digitalization of our life. Then COVID-19 came and everybody was already in, and you cannot escape anymore your education and your economy and your health and your work or whatever things that are aspect of your life you can think about is there. And adding to that, I mean, this is the normal challenges of everybody across the globe and their data and their privacy. But adding to that, the occupation and the complicated situation, for us Palestinians, it made it much more complicated. So beyond the issue of the knowledge and gathering the knowledge and researching and the policy, we also started documenting, to document the violations. And this is something that is really important, because it's very different when you do advocacy in front of a company or a government or other third parties, and you cannot show in a clear way how this is being done. And that's why in Hamle we have been emphasizing in the last few years also around the documentation. And we launched last year also a HOR platform in which we are documenting specific cases. Last year we documented about more than 1,000 cases, basically because we want to show trends, also because it's very difficult to come to a company and say, you're doing this and that. And most of the cases they will push you back and say, no, actually you don't understand. This is the whole PR language that normally they would use. But in case that you have hundreds of cases that are well documented, and then it's much difficult for them to push you back, and it's a way to do it. And also, if you are reaching out to mainstream media, etc., and whatever routes and methods you are choosing to play pressure on them, because we have to understand we are working in front of giants, like really giants. I mean, you talk about Meta, it's a company that third of humanity are using one of their products. This is not something, you need the time to digest how big they are and how influential they are, and how much they have money, they have the human resources. They are much more powerful than many other governments in terms of the resources, the abilities that they have. And then you come as a small little NGOs from somewhere, and you're trying to influencing them. So how would you do that? This is not simple at all. Even governments are struggling in front of those companies. So our method was to create as much as possible coalitions. We have created the PDRC in Palestine, which is a group of local organizations working together, sharing information, and trying to amplify the Palestinian voice. In the regional aspect of it, we work with the regional coalition of digital rights organizations, including JOSA and others, that we try also to amplify our voice. Because if one organization tries to do the work, obviously it's very difficult. But if we are a group and we are saying something, our voice will be much heard. Similarly, we did something similar also in the US. Basically, there's a group of 20 organizations who are now working together. For example, now we are running a campaign against PayPal, and the group of organizations in the US is supporting this. And the US is important also because, you know, the headquarters of those companies and decision making is happening in the US. So we need the support that coming from civic society there and to put the pressure on them. Again, I mean, having these coalitions, working with international human rights organizations, bringing into the global digital rights organizations who are working that. There are big organizations who are working globally, that we are also part of these networks and bringing them into the table. This is something that is really important. Again, all of this creates a leverage, and this is totally different than one small local organization saying something, and all of these coalitions putting the pressure on the same time on those organizations.
Thank you, Nadim. Given this positive twist on sort of the policy angle, what could be done, what should be done, let's take a different perspective, perhaps from Raya, working regionally as you do in Jordan to defend the digital rights of Palestine defenders in Jordan. In your capacity as a Palestinian working in the digital rights in Jordan, what do you believe are some of the limitations to what can be done to protect these rights of Palestinians and pro-Palestine voices, especially regionally, but also globally?
So my main interaction with this issue is via operating a hotline with the Jordan Open Source Association, JOSA, which is a digital rights organization based off of Amman. As a hotline, as an emergency response hotline for digital issues, we would receive an enormous amount of reports around people's accounts being restricted online, people's content being taken down. And when you probe a bit more, you discover it's because they've posted something around Palestine. And it's an increase. Actually, maybe 90% of the content moderation cases we deal with at JOSA, which is a Jordanian organization, have to do with the Palestinian content. So we've obviously joined the coalition, one of the coalitions that Nadim was talking about, which includes a lot of digital rights organizations around the world, like Access Now, EFF, Mnemonic, Article 19, Human Rights Watch. And it's been a long series of conversations with social media companies trying to understand what is leading to the silencing of pro-Palestine content. One of the policies that really, I tried to focus on and brought my attention was a policy or like a community standard, as Facebook like to call them, called the Dangerous Individual and Organizations Policy, or DIO policy. And so basically, to sum it up, I guess Facebook has a policy across all of its platforms, so that includes Instagram, which says we have a list of people that we consider dangerous, and this is not only people but also organizations. It's a secret list, and if you somehow mention them in praise on our platforms, you will face restrictions. So we try to probe them a bit more. So who's on the list and who's not? Who decides who's on the list and who's not? With little answers. We started to understand various things, like, for example, it is possible for a state actor to come to knock on Facebook/Meta's doors and say, hey, by the way, can you add this person on your DIO list? And there is no policy around requiring Meta to disclose any request coming from state actors. This list, or part of it, was leaked in the Facebook papers 9 months ago. And we could see, and Hamle has reported, that there is a clear bias of within a good amount of Palestinians are on the list, and a good amount of Palestinian organizations are on the list. Again, we still don't have answers about the transparency around the DIO policy and the DIO list, but we're seeing its effects. So it's as simple as, for example, a Jordan news outlet on Facebook posting news about something happening in Palestine, whether it's related to the Hamas insurgents or so on, and suddenly their page gets taken down. Their pages usually have more than 1 million followers. They get a notification saying you violated the DIO policy without specifying what exactly in the DIO policy. Did they praise? Did they? No clue. Who did they praise? It's not clear either. I mean, you can make it up from the content of the post. And then it's about talking to Facebook/Meta saying, is this person that the Facebook post is mentioning, are they on the list? And it's trying to understand, you're trying to like bring together the pieces of the puzzle. And it's a very it's great restrictions happening on accounts just because they're posting certain things. I think one of the cases that really struck me and that we received at JOSA was someone, not even a journalist, just posted a long post quoting 3 different people. This person quoted Udham Singh, who was an Indian revolutionary during the British occupation of India, Aimé Césaire, who wrote the discourse on colonialism, and Basil al-A'raj, a Palestinian revolutionary. This person's post was removed and their account was restricted. So we started probing, trying to understand, why is this happening? Who from the 3 is on the list suddenly? And can we understand? We found out that none of the 3 are on the list, and it could have been just an error of, like they always like to say, an error from the algorithm, because it's easier to blame a machine than a human. But it speaks, because we can't single out Palestine either, because it speaks to much broader content moderation issues that affect many regions around the globe. And it's the same thing we've seen while we were seeing the silencing of Palestinians online in May of 21, and before and after. It's the same that's happening in Colombia, it's the same that's happening in India and various other parts of the world. When you try to talk to Facebook, they are very, I don't know if it's an intentional or unintentional tactic, but they're very good at giving you the attention to the point where you're thinking you're progressing with them in changing policies, but then you're discovering, actually, it's been now 14 months since we've been talking to Facebook about this, and there are no results. Because every time we sit down maybe with sometimes different people, sometimes they tend to sway the conversation in the way they see fit. They decided, yeah, it's a much broader conversation to have around this, let's say, screwed up content moderation issues that are on these platforms. And so, I mean, to answer your question, these are great limitations to protecting the rights of expression of Palestinians and non-Palestinians who support Palestine on these platforms. Yeah, that's just one example of like one, what did they say? One dot in a wide ocean? I don't know expressions, but something like that, a drop in the ocean.
Thank you, Raya. I think that's actually a very relevant segue and a helpful segue to the first question I'd like to ask Nadim. Given the limitations of what can be done, we know that Israel recently succeeded at passing the Facebook bill. And Nadim, you wrote an op-ed about it in the New Arab on the 14th, just a few days ago. Could you share your thoughts around the latest Facebook bill and what its implications are for Palestinian free speech?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, just to be accurate, I mean, it passed like half of the way. I didn't like pass it till the end, because we are talking about a situation where there is no coalition anymore, and a shaky political situation internally in the Israeli system, and they are going for elections soon. But just to say that basically this bill is not something that is controversial between the two political sides in Israel. So whatever coalition will be formed after the elections, it is expected to continue with this legislation, maybe with a different version, but it's expected not to be taken from the table. Anyhow, so we are talking about a law that want to come to regulate the content, basically, under the title that it will allow the government to remove harmful content from the online. And basically, the law will be giving the prosecutor and the general attorney office to go to courts and to ask for a district court, basically, to issue an order of removal of certain content, because by their measures and by their understanding, this content is harmful and illegal by the Israeli code, etc. And this would be done in one side. So basically, the other side would not be invited to the court. The evidence would be secret evidence that would not be shared. So in short and in brief, basically, there's no any kind of due process. Right, and then the judge would issue this order, and then they would go to the company. Like either you remove this content in 48 hours, or you would suffer from heavy fines of hundreds of thousands of shekels. The basic assumption is obviously that these websites, including news websites, would be taking this down because they don't want to pay the fees. The fines, and again, similarly, this would happen also with the social media companies, who are like the main target of this law, but not the only one. So the law speaks about any site. So it could be a news site, a local Palestinian news site that speak about certain issue in certain terminology, and according to the general attorney, this is incitement, and he wanted to be taken off, and he can enforce it. But the bigger content and the bigger issue would be around the social media companies and how they would react or not. Normally, from our experience in other countries, when there is a legislation, the way that they go out of this contradiction, if according to them, this is not contradicting their community standards, they basically would say, I would block this content from the specific country that the court ordered, but the other people from other world can still see this piece of content. So it's interesting to see how this develop. Obviously, this is not a normal state and not a normal government, because this is the occupation reality. So which laws they are following? Because I mean, the basic argument of the companies would say, if I'm operating in certain, let's say Germany, I would follow the German law and the German regulations and laws and courts. But in this case, if a person sitting in Ramallah and he writes, we have the right to resist occupation, and occupation is harming us, etc., or any kind of criticism of the Israeli government and its occupation, and then the Israeli government is asking to remove this for content from the company. So the company would go according to the Palestinian law, according to the international law, according to the Israeli martial law, or according to the Israeli civic law. Like which law they would follow. And this is the interesting debate of the social media. Unfortunately, until now, they're following the Israeli government decisions. I just want also to add, maybe Nadim, another part of it, just to explain that this is coming on the background that there is extensive voluntary, we call it voluntary takedowns by Facebook, because Facebook is already, and Meta and the other companies are already extensively cooperating with the Israeli government. It's not a situation that they are not cooperating. It's a situation that they're cooperating in rates of 80 to 90%, and now the Israeli government wants 100% control of the content. This is the issue, so people also understand that what was happening until now is still happening is on a voluntary basis, and it will become an obligatory basis once the law is completely effective.
Yeah, it truly isn't unprecedented. It's worrying, but not surprising, unfortunately. Let's go back to Raya. Raya, this is a question that I have for you, given some of our recent work with anti-normalization groups in the Gulf. Given your research and work in regional dynamics when it comes to defending Palestine voices, what is being done, especially if, in normalized states where activists and anti-normalizing organizers are being attacked by very repressive regimes, certainly both physically on the street and also digitally. What can you tell us about that, and what could be done in this context?
Okay, I'll talk about two cases in Jordan. In Jordan has unfortunately signed the deal with the occupation back in '94, if I'm not wrong. In 2020, Ahmad Hajjaj, a caricaturist, criticized the normalization deals. He's a Palestinian Jordanian and lives in Amman. So he drew a caricature whereby he criticized the normalization deal between the UAE and the Israeli occupation. It's a good drawing. You should look it up. But in any case, he was arrested for 5 days because of, and he was arrested in Jordan. That's the thing. So it had nothing to do with Jordan. His drawing was criticizing two other entities. And he was arrested in Jordan by the Jordanian government. In December of the same year, he was, as far as I know, the case was closed. The case against him was closed because there was not really any complaint that was raised against Ahmad Hajjaj. It was simply a charge that they decided to give him, that he is ruining the Jordan's relationships with sister countries. He's not the only person who was charged with this dubious charge, which is, if I'm not wrong, it's under the anti-terrorism law in Jordan, but I need to check, so don't quote me on it. But he's not the only one. There is many other folks in Jordan who have been arrested under the same thing for criticizing normalization deals and for criticizing the Israeli occupation. And this includes Anas al-Jamal. Anas al-Jamal is a young 24-year-old activist from Irbid. Irbid is a city in the north of Jordan. He's known to be Al-Hattif, so he's known among protest groups as the person who chants and says very, very good chants in protests. And so Anas has been in and out of prison since, if I'm not wrong, since 2019. Just looking up in Arabic, Al-Hurriya Anas al-Jamal, you can see how many times he's been charged and detained, arrested. Lately in March, he simply tweeted a post of him criticizing the normalization deals between Arab nations and the Israeli occupation. I think it was a picture of him spraying the Israeli occupation's flag on the floor. But I believe this was what he was charged for. He was put in prison in March of 2022, released a month later. Then suddenly, a few weeks after, they decided to again arrest him from his home. He's a 24-year-old and the only provider for his family, so it's a very worrying case. But this is a very common trope we see across the region. The more they normalize the deals with the occupying power, the more any form of expression that is anti this sort of deals, that is critical of these sorts of deals, become prone to arrests and charges. There is a third case that I'd like to talk about, that of Ustaz Saeed Diab, who is part of the Wahda party, which is a leftist party in Jordan. Saeed wrote an article on the independence, or in commemoration of the Jordan's independence in 2020. His article basically said, we're not exactly independent if we're still so reliant on the West, and we have any form of pressures coming from the Zionist occupation. And so he was also arrested from his home because he published this article at the time, and then released either a few weeks later or a few months later. So it's very unfortunate that we do see this, but it's expected. And so this results in many people worrying more and more about what they can and cannot say, specifically around something that is very close to their hearts, which is the Palestinian cause.
Thank you, Raya. I'd like to ask you both something, and I think it's important that we spotlight the Unity Intifada and what it's meant for Palestine solidarity in Palestine and across the world and regionally. Social media activism becoming the gold standard for activism in a way, transnational activism. How has the Unity Intifada impacted or affected in any way cross-movement building? The fact that now, like Nadim, you were mentioning, now we have data collection of these instances of violations. How are we cooperating now that the rest of the world is listening? How are we combining with these movements? How are we helping each other? Is there cross-movement collaboration that goes beyond Palestine or Jordan and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very interesting and important moment, May 2021, because you felt that also it unified the Palestinian people from different places and different aspects. Also, many allies, many Arab famous influencers and others. We can say even like people who normally not, not the activist type, people who normally influencers who are speaking about food and about design, felt that there is so much injustice in this case. Like, having Muhammad al-Kurd live streaming, and people are seeing this like really harsh situation and of injustice, and people being kicked out and their home being taken from them. And I think it was difficult for anybody just to stand by and not to take any action, even if you're not used to be activists. And I think part of the struggle with the companies was at the moment that people who are important for the companies, because these influencers generate lots of traffic, lots of engagement, lots of things. And the moment that they are starting speaking about it and they feel this shadow banning and putting down their reachability, it was a significant moment. But it meant that when there is more unity and when there is more people coming in, allies, Palestinians and allies, there could happen a shift in the narratives, because normally especially in the mainstream media. If we follow also the mainstream media, how they reported at the beginning and how they reported after the intensive social media work, it pushed them at certain point to even like New York Times publishing about the martyrs in Gaza and the killed ones and their pictures, things that they have not been doing before. And normally they try to whitewash the occupation, etc. So I think it was an interesting moment to see how social media is influencing. Obviously, because of this, also the struggle and the other side was, fierce in their efforts to shut down, to report, to do whatever tricks and possibilities and moves that they can do to exert pressure on the companies so they would take down the Palestinian story, especially when it comes for people who are doing live streams, and that was really crucial and interesting.
Raya, being someone who does work regionally in Palestine solidarity, what could you say about the Unity Intifada's impact on cross-movement development?
I mean, I think we, as Jordan Open Source Association and other organization, we started to join Hamle in their efforts as well to fight for against the silencing of Palestinian voices online and to try and raise awareness of it. And so this sort of coalition building happened almost organically as a result of what was happening. And as we were seeing the events unfold in May 2021, there was also this great awareness, I believe, a reckoning of some sort around what's happening and why this matters, even beyond Palestine. I think there was also a lot of awareness around, I think I see more people as well beyond coalition building and beyond that, because this also matters towards like this cross-national like these cross-national working groups, is this sort of awareness that people are more aware about content moderation, how it affects them. I think they're more aware. There is this I feel like people now use algorithm as a metaphor to say the algorithm decided to censor me, but at least there is this sort of awareness that there is someone, and there is these, like Nadim said, these huge, gigantic entities that are behind the platforms we use on an everyday basis. And I think this awareness really matters for any future movement we try to build, and we are consistently building. I do want to mention a couple of other things that are beyond Palestine but matter to Palestine, and also related to social media that, again, forgot to mention it. Esprit de l'escalier, I just remembered as well. First of all, and I think this was mentioned many times within Al-Shabaka and other within other policy groups, is the double standards that often we see on social media. When I was mentioning about the dangerous individuals and organizations list, one of the people we know, or organizations we know, are on the list is the Azov Battalion. Azov Battalion is an armed resistance group, but it's a neo-Nazi group that's Ukrainian. When Russia started its invasion on Ukraine in February, March of this year, we saw that Facebook decided to give an exception to the praising of this group specifically. And so there was a lot of noise happening around, okay, so you're giving these people an exception to praising an armed resistance group that is obviously on your dangerous and individuals and organizations list. But what about Palestinians who also, don't they get that right? How shouldn't there be a policy around you setting exceptions like that? But it's also useful to look at what's happening in Iran as well, and in that regard, because when we talk about exceptions, I think it would be useful to follow Massa's Ali Mardani's work from Article 19, who works extensively to cover how social media companies, pretty much like what happens in Palestine, also silence Iranian dissenters or people who are dissenting against the Iranian regime. There is a simple story to tell here, which is for a long time, last year when the protests were happening in Iran and people were protesting and chanting death to Khamenei, Facebook decided that this was a direct incitement of violence and take down all of the posts. So digital rights organizations, including Massa and Article 19, knocked on Facebook's door saying, this is we're not exactly referring to Khamenei as this entity. Put anyone in his chair, we will be chanting death to this person. We are chanting death to the regime. We're chanting death to the dictatorship. And so I believe that, if I'm not wrong with my facts, that Facebook Meta implemented a 2-week exception for people. So you have now 2 weeks to chant death to Khamenei on social media, and then we're gonna shut down all your posts again. But then, so things developed, and this year there were protests again. And again, like Nadim says, people live stream protests, people live streams this sort of violations. And people were live streaming in Iran on Instagram, other protests, and the same chants were happening, and the posts were taken down again. I think what's notable here in Iran's case is that the Iranian regime censors most of social media channels except for Instagram. So when it's Instagram now acting in the role of the censor, it's just disheartening for someone who's just trying to express their frustration with the regime, their dissent as well. So yes, it is beyond what's happening in Palestine. It speaks a lot to the terrible practices that we see across these companies. Yeah.
Thank you both very much for this very insightful and enriching conversation. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But Raya and Nadim, thank you again for joining us tonight and for sharing your insights into what needs to be done to protect Palestinians and their allies on a variety of digital platforms. Whether with limitations or otherwise, the work certainly needs to be done. I think it's important also to highlight, as Nadim told us earlier on, and as Raya told us throughout, that this isn't just the Israeli regime. It's authoritarian regimes, including the Palestinian Authority. It's normalized Arab states. It's Israel's co-opted and coerced allies globally. This is truly a transnational phenomenon. And as we witness on a daily basis, the digital sphere is the mechanism for resistance and movement building, even if it is the mechanism for repression. And this certainly explains why Israel and other regimes are taking such concerted efforts to attack activists in these spaces. And while this repression will continue and will possibly worsen, there's no doubt that action on our part has and will continue to counter these measures and to contribute to collective movement building. And I think Hamle is a great example of how successful this work can be. So the more they repress, the more we should continue to strategize collectively, because repression is ultimately a badge of honor and a sign that what we're doing is building towards liberation. I'd also like to thank you, our audience all over the world, for attending this Policy Lab tonight and for submitting your thoughts and questions. Before we sign off, as always, I'd like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowd-funded program of Al-Shabaka, so we do rely on your continued support. If you're able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate link that should now appear on your screens. And Nadim and Raya, thank you again so much, and happy Thursday evening to you both.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Of course, ahla wa sahla. Bye-bye, everyone.